Hello, and welcome to the first edition of Adapt2Changes video series, where we have conversations around how people successfully adapt to changes. Today, I'm happy to be joined by Jeanne-Marie Rachlin, who is a longtime educator with a focus on math, who has also done some administrative work as a vice principal, but the majority of her career, and certainly the last 30 years of her career, was really spent teaching high school math, including AP calculus, both AB and the BC levels. And primarily, she has spent her career, certainly the whole career has been in the Bay Area of San Francisco, but mostly at Los Gatos High School, certainly for the last 30 years. So welcome, Jeanne-Marie.
Thank you, Brett. I'm happy to be here.
And I should also mention that Jeanne-Marie is my sister-in-law as well. I chose Jeanne-Marie for this conversation, not only because she's my sister-in-law, but because her experience lends itself so well to the topic that we're covering today. And I think that given the situation that we have going on, this is, August of 2020, given what's going on with COVID-19, education and teaching is going through lots of changes right now. It always has been, but it perhaps has never gone through as much dramatic changes as it's going on now. So it's certainly a very timely topic. So,
Yes.
So with that being said, Jeanne-Marie, talk a little bit describe a change that you experienced, during your teaching career, and elaborate a little bit about how that impacted you.
Okay. I think I'd like to talk about technology. There were a lot of changes in my 43 years of teaching, but I would say technology changes were probably the most challenging for me. And I'm going to mention three that I'll allude to. The switch from doing math by hand to doing it with the graphing calculator. And I'm not talking about the rinky-dink for operation calculators. I'm talking about graphing calculators for calculus that do everything that the old mainframe computers did. The second change I'll mention is the switch from handwritten gradebook to digital gradebook. And the third one I'll mention is the mandate that each teacher had to have a website. And I want to give perspective, I want to just say that these changes might not seem like much to some younger folks, but they were a big deal to those of us who grew up, going through high school and college, writing our term papers on the old-time typewriters, and to get your one copy, putting the carbon paper underneath. So this, these technology has probably been my biggest challenge.
And did most of those changes that you described, did they happen to you, or did you initiate those?
They all sort of happened to me. The first one, the switch to the graphing calculator, came about through the College Board. My calculus courses, I taught all levels of math, but the last number of years, my biggest contribution was in the area of advanced placement calculus, as you mentioned, Brett. And the advanced placement calculus curriculum is mandated by the College Board. And they said on a particular year, thou shalt teach with graphing calculators. And so that was how that first one happened. And the other two, the digital gradebook and the website, were required by the administration, our principal.
So when those changes occurred, how did that make you feel?
Overwhelmed. Very overwhelmed.
And what impact do you think that being overwhelmed, what impact did that change have on your work life and even your home life at that time? How did you proceed in terms of overcoming that feeling of being overwhelmed?
Well, a lot of extra work. I've always been a hard worker, and some stress. And I alleviate my stress by working hard. So I would, they would usually tell us these changes. I would usually know that changes were coming, which helps people like me who are planners. And so I would usually spend a good bit of the summer doing extra things to be more prepared for the change that was coming.
So that's a great point. You knew a little bit of ahead of time, but I think it's very important that you were proactive in taking these changes,
Definitely.
on. you did not, it doesn't sound like you waited for them to happen and then decided to change your approach. You were changing your approach, that summer prior, you were practicing, I take it, in terms of sort of the new technology. Is that accurate?
Definitely. I would get things set up, and in the case of the graphing calculators, I was learning learning how to do it and going to conferences and studying on my own.
So how do you feel that, did you see and notice others that were going through similar changes with this technology? How did they deal with it differently from you in certain ways? Like, how did you see people who dealt with it where they may not have been as prepared over the summer? What kind of challenges do you think that they had when they started school that year?
Well, I think it's, teachers are a cross population like everybody else, and you would see ones who were on top of it and ones who weren't, and just kind of, flew by the seat of their pants. But the students knew who was who, and it really helped to be prepared. And some people are, in my case, because I'm an older person during the technology changes, some of the younger ones could afford to be more relaxed about it but I felt that I needed to, to get ahead of the game.
So with that in mind, do you feel that when you say you're ahead of the game, do you feel that made your school year easier to adjust to than some of your, colleagues, and potentially did that make you potentially more successful in the short term because it was easier for you to adjust and hit the ground running?
Definitely. Yeah. That relaxed me to know that I had done my homework, and I was, I knew that the school year would be a little difficult as I worked through whatever the new change was. But I always felt I had to do a certain amount of work to be confident, and it made me confident. So yes, I felt successful as I went through it.
Well, is there anything else that drove you to, I mean, I know that you're a person that prepares well. I mean, I know that you are proactive. What drives you to do that though? And in this case with change, was there anything else that was driving you to be so diligent in preparing for those changes?
I think for me personally, like you said, I have a lot of drive, and I was interested. I have to say in the beginning, and I'll maybe talk about that a little later, but I was kind of dragged kicking and screaming into some of these changes, and it's been a lifelong process for me to. I wouldn't say that I actually embrace change, but it's been a long time process for me to learn that there are advantages. I guess in adapting to the change, I would say that I learned with experience that there are advantages to technology. At the beginning, I didn't think so. I really did not. I wanted to stick with the status quo. But for example, in the case of the graphing calculator change, I realized within a pretty short period of time that it allowed me to do way more interesting problems with the kids, having the graphing calculators, real life practical problems where the calculations would be too cumbersome to do by hand. So I started to try to focus on the advantages of technology. And believe me, this has been a lifelong process for me, which is why I chose technology for this interview, because it has been a growth thing for me. And I learned very quickly that I taught, my teaching was richer after these changes. I could be the old teacher that I was, but I could also be the new teacher that I was becoming. And I was able to reach out to students in ways that I had not been able to before. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up. You talked about, being dragged, kicking and screaming to the change, but then you saw the opportunities that the change could bring from a positive perspective. It sounds like you evolved kind of from being, concerned about the change and potentially a little bit closed-minded to it to becoming very open-minded to it. And that, would you say that once you opened your mind up to the change and saw the possibilities, did that make it easier for you to embrace the change?
I think so. Like I say, it's been a process, and sometimes in the change, I frankly sometimes I would choose the lesser change. For example, in the website case, it was mandated by our administration that thou shalt have a website, and uh, and these were the real early years. Before it was easy, before they had all the software to help you. But um, so I had sort of a minimal website where I posted my homework, just what the homework was for the students. And lots of the other teachers were making much more elaborate websites. And I made a decision at the beginning of that year to just do the minimum. And I have to say my AP Calculus grades, which is what I was judged by, they were spectacular going into that, and they got more spectacular as we went through that website change. And I made a decision that the lesser change was right for me because I was spending a lot of time in other endeavors, working with students individually, for example, which is one of my big things. So I didn't see that I would get the benefit from my time. Everybody only has a limited amount of time. And I felt that my time was better spent in what I was doing, and I was meeting the requirement. I was posting those grades, and a lot of times handouts and such on the website. But I made a decision that the benefit in time for me would not be, I would not get the benefit as much in return by way more time into this elaborate website. So I approached the changes different ways. And again, the way that I am now is a process, has been a process and a culmination of all the different experiences that I've had.
Yeah, it's fascinating because you kind of took an analytical approach in terms of how much you should do on one of those changes. You could have spent a lot more
Yes.
time trying to have more elaborate websites, but that was not necessary. You wanted to meet the requirement. And I think it was good, obviously, that you did get on the web because it did make it easier for your students to obviously get the homework. But you also knew
Yes.
that they needed to focus on the math aspect of it and not get too caught up in the bells and whistles. But I think part of the ability to do that, though, goes back to that preparation. You were not doing this in a reactive way. You had time to think about it, and I think that's really important. Part of my assessment of your ability to adapt to these changes and why you were successful is the fact that you were able to proactively work on this ahead of time. You weren't reactive to it. If you had been reactive to it, you've spent an inordinate amount of time trying to either have a better website or stressing out about not having as good a website rather than focusing on what's important. You met the standard, you adapted to the change, but then you also kept the standard going in terms of the expectation going from a math perspective where everybody needed to be. So it's just fascinating how you sort of went through that process looking back on it. What
Yes.
from when you were going through these changes, did you notice times, like how did you approach, or how did you feel about being resilient? When my sense is that when you're going through changes, you're oftentimes failing at things or making mistakes when you're doing things for the first time. Do you have an example of a place where you may have struggled a little bit up front, and then you obviously got the hang of it, but you felt you could accomplish it because you had built some of that resilience over time?
Yes. I learned. Yes, I have a good anecdote on that. Um, I learned to. I have a few things to say about resilience. I learned to work from my strength. I and it didn't register right away. During the time that there was a particular anecdote when during the time when we were having to do the digital grade book. This had just happened, and I at the end of the year I had a habit of doing an end of year critique with my students. I would I would say, okay, your grades are in. I'm not going to change them. This is your opportunity to say whatever you want to say. Tell me what I did right. Tell me what I did wrong. And that's one of the best things I did probably in teaching. It can be a very humbling experience too, because kids are pretty, I taught mostly seniors who are, they're big kids, but they could be very honest. And so I approached the topic of technology. I said, tell me what you think. Do I need to put more effort into certain areas? I said, I know that I'm one of your, I know I'm the type of teacher who still hand writes some of her handouts. And I use Word when I can, but Word is harder when you're dealing with math symbols. I said, and I know I'm kind of, with the grade book, actually at that time I was still keeping a handwritten grade book as well as the digital one. I said, so what do you think? And I was stunned at their answer. I expected them to say, yeah, Ms. Rachlin, you need to up your game in technology. You need to do this, that, and the other thing. But that's not what they said. What they said was, no, we like that you're so personally accessible. We like your personal touch, which I've always thought was my strength, reaching out to kids, trying to make a connection with each student. And they said, for example, when we ask some of our teachers about our grades, they'll say, go look on the computer. It's on the computer. It's on the digital grade book. But you would sit us down and go over the grade, analyze the grade, tell us how we needed to be, what we needed to get on our next test to get the grade that we wanted, and so forth. So I learned to deal with change by reminding myself of my strengths and not throwing out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. When I make a change, keep the essence of who I am. And a couple of other things that helped me with being more resilient was it's hard for some of us to reach out to others expressing in a sense of I need some help because I'm not as good at this. Well, I learned to do that. I learned to reach out to my younger colleagues who were just so supportive. And I learned that people want to help. The kids, I learned to ask the kids. I hated to ask the kids at the beginning because I felt like they would see me as not professional or whatever. But I learned over time that they love to be asked if I had a problem with my computer or whatever. So, and I guess the other thing I would say about resilience is I learned pretty much what you've been talking about, Brett, and that is for me, and I think for most of us, to take charge of the situation, to make a plan. Maybe I wasn't going to do every part of the change in 1 year. Maybe I was going to just take one aspect of it and develop that and then save another aspect for next year. So I learned to not, to take charge of it and to kind of make a plan for myself.
Well, what's interesting about your answer, and I loved your answer, when you talked about talking to your students and getting their kind of input in terms of how you were going about this, especially with the grades and how you shared and talked to them about their grades. You really also were illustrating talking to your buyers. Your students were your buyers from that perspective in terms of they were ones who were having to deal with that technology change as well. And you have to bring them along as part of that change. I mean, it's not only impacting you, it's impacting them. And if the change does not go well with them, it's not going to necessarily go well for you. And it sounds like by being able to ask them those questions, you were able to understand how to tailor this to them and how much was enough in terms of just being focused entirely on digital, yet having that personal touch with them.
Yes, and I learned that, yeah,
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I wanted to throw in one more thing there. I learned that it's okay to not, those of us who are perfectionists, I learned that it's okay to not have to master every part. Technology is something where really nobody, and my husband has been so supportive on this, your brother has done a wonderful job of reminding me that I don't have to be a master of every single part of technology. And I have a good anecdote on that. That helped me personally. I remember I was at a conference one summer, and I overheard a teacher saying, "Oh my goodness," she said, "I have to do these changes every single year, and it's getting to be so much pressure, and I'm just going to take early retirement." And I thought to myself, how sad. That was kind of how I was feeling, but I wasn't feeling like I was going to let these changes run me out of the business. And I started thinking, how sad is that to lose a really good teacher because she feels like she has to keep up with all this stuff. And I started learning to talk to myself to say, Jeanne-Marie, don't get overwhelmed. Pick, like I said, pick one part of it and master that. So learning to not get overwhelmed, learning to not be so perfectionist, to accomplish what my goals without having to feel like I was, an IT guru, which I know
Right.
I'll never be. That's a big part of the process for me.
Well, and by the way, you just gave a great example of you were selling yourself as the buyer because you had to buy into that change and you analyzed yourself and you kind of asked yourself, how am I going to adapt to this change? And it sounds like you decided that you were going to be, to reduce your, that feeling of being overwhelmed. You decided to say, look, I don't have to do all this at one time. I can break this up into chunks. I don't have to be an IT expert to satisfy these change requirements. And so by doing that, you were able to embrace the change incrementally without, feeling like you had to like leave teaching. And, what a sad state that would have been because these changes started really 20, 25 years ago, and you taught up until 2 or 3 years ago. So you would have missed a large part of your career of where you were continuing to grow in your career. And so if you hadn't adapted those changes and understood how you were going to adapt those changes by kind of analyzing yourself as how you're going to buy into those changes, you wouldn't have been able to grow as the teacher that you were and became.
That's right. It is a life process. And I have to say that I've had to learn to be open-minded about the whole thing. And I've actually worked on that a whole lot in myself. And I'm going to actually mention a book because one of my colleagues who is actually my age I really was resistant to technology. I really was. And I had to work on it myself. And he said, I had this book. He was very good with technology. And I thought, I really admired that he was. But he said, you need to read this book. And I pulled it off my bookshelf just because I thought it might help somebody else because it was really an attitudinal change for me. My attitude was bad toward technology. This book is by a physicist. It's called Physics of the Future by Michio Kaku, who's a well-known international physicist. And it talks about all the changes that are going to occur that he predicts will occur in the 21st century. And a lot of them will occur in my lifetime. And it really was an attitude changer for me because I just started thinking, Jeanne-Marie, you're stuck in the status quo. You need to embrace. Well, embrace is a little strong word for me. I'm not going to ever embrace change because it's just sort of my personality. I think a lot of us we get stuck in our ways, so to speak, and that's a downside to aging too, which is another thing that I think has been good for me. It help you as you get older to learn to be open-minded. So I really worked on it, and I'm learning to see the positive in change. And as you said, it's to see the growth in yourself.
Well, and the fact that that what would be so sad is your inability to grow if you don't adapt to those changes. And you recognize
exactly
that,
right.
you may have been resistant to change, but you had enough desire to continue your career. You liked your career. You were making a positive impact on lots of students. You said, I'm going to figure out a way to adapt to these changes so that I can continue to grow in my career and continue making that positive impact. Some people may, not choose to do that, but that's limiting themselves if you get stuck in the status quo, you're definitely going to limit your opportunities going forward.
Yes, yes. And you mentioned earlier about your target buyers. I learned to to reassure my students and my parents, who are, I guess you could say, my target buyers,
Mm-hmm.
that I would help them to achieve their goals. I remember one back to school, one very memorable back to school night, when this was when we had just changed we were just learning the graphing calculators, and I had decided to keep the old textbook. And a parent came up to me at back to school night and said, "Now, Mrs. Rachlin, I'm a little concerned that you have this old textbook that makes no reference to the graphing calculators." And I knew right away that I needed to reassure him that what I was doing was going to help his son get the very best advanced placement calculus grade that he could get. So what I told him was the following. I said, "You're right. This textbook does not have any reference to graphing calculators." I said, "But don't worry." I said, "I've got a stack of handouts where I'm supplementing on the graphing calculator, which I've been working on all summer to address." And I said, "I made a conscious decision not to get the newer textbook because the algebra in the newer textbooks is not as strong. And to do well on the AP Calculus exam, the student needs to be really strong in algebra, and they also need to, yes, they need to know the graphing calculator." So I learned to you could call it spinning it, but it was the truth. I wasn't saying
Right.
anything untrue. But I learned to say that at back to school night for those few years and on the first day of school, because the students, I realized they wouldn't be worried if they didn't see, graphing calculators. So, and in the end, I would hear the students saying to each other, and it was true, the old textbook was so much better than the newer ones. Eventually, they figured it out, and the newer textbooks became good as well. So you're right. You have to always work with your customer, I guess you could call it, your target buyers, as you call them, and think about what is your responsibility to them, and what is it that they want. And if you can reach out to them, then I think you'll be successful with the changes.
Well, and that's a great example of how you succeeded in terms of kind of addressing their needs as buyers. And it's a great segue kind of to kind of our last, question, and really it could promote some discussion here is, how do you think current teachers can adapt to changes dealing with the issues resulting from the pandemic? And, thinking about what you just talked about, think about the teachers who are now having to communicate to parents about the change from, teaching in person to teaching virtually, especially for, juniors and seniors of high school who have complex classes, have other concerns about going to college. How are they going to be able to get the education that they need and all the support that they need in a completely different environment than it normally has been the case? Teachers are going to have to explain that to their buyers, both students and parents. How do you see some of them, the teachers, being able to adapt to those changes going on now?
I would mention a couple of things. If I, as a teacher or as an administrator, which I would say two things. If I were an administrator, for example, I would probably all in the pre-class, pre-beginning of school classes, I would present an array of technological tools, and that teachers could choose, and I would preface it by saying, "Now, I'm going to show you all of these," and actually I would have experts showing them, but I would say, now don't get overwhelmed. I want you to pick one or two of these tools, and that will help you accomplish the goals that you need to accomplish. And you can work on other tools later, but don't get overwhelmed. focus on one or two things. And I would say a theme that I mentioned earlier, and that is remember your strength. You are a teacher. You are someone who knows how to communicate. And more than that, you know what your students need to learn in their curriculum in order to proceed to the next level. You know how to get there. You will figure it out. This is different. It's totally different, but work from your strengths. Keep thinking, keep your eye on the ball, know what it is that you need to accomplish, and it will be done differently, but you will get through this, and you will do what needs to be done to teach the students what they need to know.
Well, I think that's great counsel, Jeanne-Marie, and it'll be interesting to see that with the variety of different teaching going on across the country, hybrid approaches, all online, all in person. But sometimes I think some schools will have all in person, which will then shift to online very quickly if outbreaks occur of COVID. So it's going to be a very interesting year, but I think you gave some great counsel to get people started thinking about how they can approach, the school year. Thank you so much for taking the time today, Jeanne-Marie. Really appreciate it. This has been a great conversation. Oh, you're welcome. It's been a great conversation about
enjoyed talking with you
about how to adapt to changes. So once again, this is Bret Rachlin with my sister-in-law, Jeanne-Marie Rachlin, longtime teacher, talking about her success in adapting to changes over her career, especially with adapting to technology. Until our next episode, we will see you soon. Thank you.